This week we're going to be focusing on synthesizing sources, and so we're going to be talking about how you find common themes among your sources and how you talk about them. So often what I see in student papers is kind of a list of article summary. Article A found this, Article B found this, Article C found this, without a lot of integration of the ideas. And so the goals for the next few weeks are really to help you identify what are the primary themes across the literature, what ideas or information are you finding in all of your articles or in several articles, so that instead of saying Article A found this, Article B found this, you can say something like, with regard to topic X, here's everything we know from the literature as a whole, or here's the big debate, or study A found this piece of it and study B found this piece. And so you're citing multiple studies to address your topic. You read in the Landrum book, you're reading chapter 5 this week, which talks about literature reviews, which is what you're doing for this class. And I did just want to comment that the Landrum book focuses kind of on the literature review as an introduction to an empirical study. For this paper, we're kind of stopping there. So all we're doing is the introduction, or all we're doing is the literature review. We're not doing the whole empirical study, but the process is the same. Essentially, you are writing an introduction to a research article. Okay, so the reason that we want to synthesize our sources and kind of making sure that we're citing them appropriately is that we want to make sure that we are using other people's ideas to support our arguments. So when you're supporting your argument, you want to make sure that you are using academic sources, especially if you're writing an academic article. If you're citing a lot of academic sources, your readers are going to be skeptical. You want to make sure that you are citing things completely. Now, this doesn't mean you have to include every single component of the study, but what it does mean is you don't cite a piece that supports your evidence and don't cite the piece that contradicts your evidence. You want to make sure you're kind of giving weight to both sides of the argument. You want to treat studies fairly and respectably. You want to, all studies have weaknesses, and it is okay to occasionally, if there's like a major weakness or a reason that you think the findings won't generalize to your study, it is okay to point these out, but you need to kind of acknowledge that there's always some value in a study. And you also, just kind of another note as you're writing, you want to make sure that you're putting citations where they make sense. So generally citations go at the end of a sentence, but if you have multiple ideas in your sentence, you want to put the citations kind of at the end of a thought. Often this comes before a comma or other punctuation. So if you're saying some studies found support for this argument while other studies have contradicted the argument, and you put all your citations at the end, then it's not going to be clear which studies support and which studies contradict it. In contrast, if you say something like some studies support this argument, put the supporting articles there, while others contradict this argument and put the contradicting articles there, then that can really kind of strengthen your argument and make it a little clearer what you're citing and why. Okay, so this is an example. Pollination of this plant has been studied in both field and the laboratory. So if we look at this, we are not sure whether Arnold or Howard studied it in the field or the lab or both. Whereas if we separate it out, this plant has been studied in the field by Arnold in 1962 and in the laboratory by Howard in 1979. It's much clearer about where exactly they have been cited, or where exactly each study investigated this. And in contrast, the third example really shows gives a different meaning, right? And so if it's the case that they both study pollination in both the field and the laboratory, then we would want to phrase it in the third way. So just how you put your citations and where you put them can have meaning, and so you need to be kind of careful about how you use those. Okay, so the worksheet you're going to do today is about synthesizing sources. Okay, and so this is a tool, once you've read all your articles, to kind of think about how your articles fit together. And so as you're synthesizing sources, you're organizing by deciding which information you're looking for. So you want to think about what are the key pieces of information. We've probably talked about in our meeting kind of how you're going to support your thesis, what the arguments you're going to make are. And so often those are the pieces of information you're looking for, or the different aspects of the problem that you're looking for. So kind of keeping that in mind throughout the process of reading your articles can help make this synthesizing strategy a little bit easier or difficult. And you might similarly look back at if you use the Excel file for note-taking, or if you use a Word document, if you identify, okay, I'm going to, maybe my paper is on how parental relationships impact academics. And the first aspect I'm going to talk about is parent-child attachment. The second aspect I'm going to talk about is what kind of stimulating environment parents offer. And the third thing I'm going to talk about is parent IQ. Well, I've got some pretty clear sections of my paper that are going to support my argument that parents impact academic achievement. And so I might go back through and look at my articles and figure out which ones talk about attachment, which ones talk about environment, which ones talk about genetic influences, and identify those. So kind of marking similar information from each source in a similar manner as you're taking notes or after you take notes can make this process easier. The next step is to kind of identify how much information is common or shared among sources. So thinking about, there's kind of 3 different levels of shared information. So A is summary of information in all sources. This is central information. This might be a basic definition of parenting or something like that. Next is kind of identifying information that is in some sources. So you might have a couple of articles that talk about attachment, so it's probably pretty important, but not all of your articles talk about attachment. So this may be central, but it could be maybe less relevant to your topic or maybe just one piece of it. And then finally, there might be information that's not shared among your sources. So this is kind of peripheral information. It might be specific to the source you're reading, not necessarily to the research in general. So maybe you find one article that goes into, a lot of detail about the specific genes that influence intelligence. You might decide that's not really super relevant for me. I might not include that in my paper. And so then I would encourage you to kind of start listing this, starting with that central information and kind of working away to kind of incorporate less shared information. So the Synthesizing Sources worksheet walks you through all the steps of this, but one of the things that sometimes students struggle with is kind of figuring out how to lay out this worksheet. So I wanted to give you an example of exactly what this looks like. So the first thing that it asks you to identify is some themes. Okay, so the themes at the top are the topics. Whatever your pieces of your argument are going to be, or whatever the different components of your argument are, or the different aspects that you're talking about, those are going to be your themes. I've got a fake example of, let's say I'm writing an article about friendship and the college transition and how that influences well-being. So my first theme is about how the college transition influences well-being. Okay, so some of my articles have talked about that. My second theme is about friendship stability. So do people generally maintain the same friendships over time, or do they generally change? And then the third theme is friendships in college. So specifically, what do we know about college friendships? Okay, and so I've read a bunch of articles. Some of them have addressed one piece of this, some of them have addressed all 3 pieces, some of them have just addressed one piece. And so what you're going to do in this worksheet is really think about how each of your articles fits into each of those 3 arguments. I've asked you to just incorporate, I believe, 5 sources. By this point, you should have read 10 sources, and the more articles you do this for, the better. So I encourage you to kind of take the time and do this thoroughly. But just an example. So I've got this first source, which is made up, and this first source talks about how the college transition influences well-being. So they found increased loneliness during the transition, more depression after the transition, but not later on. Those were their key findings, and that really relates to how the transition affects well-being. It doesn't have anything to do with friendship, so I left those squares blank. My second article does talk about friendship stability. So it says the average length of high school friendships is 1 year. And they also found that most students maintain high school friendships in the first year of college, or maintain high school friendships in the first year of college. So that also tells me a little bit about how friendship changes during the transition to college. This study didn't address the first point of well-being, but it does address my other two. A third study found higher quality friendships were associated with better well-being, and that college friendships were higher in quality compared to high school friendships. So this one doesn't talk about how long those friendships last, but it does address the other 2 points. And so you can see that for each of these studies, I've identified how kind of the main findings or how their findings relate to each of my 3 themes. Now, there may be other things in the study that aren't relevant at all, and that's okay. You don't have to include every piece of the study. So maybe this study looking at high school and college friendships also looked at how friendships affected academic achievement. But I'm not talking about academic achievement in my paper. It doesn't really fit into any of my key ideas, so I don't need to talk about those findings. I can focus on the findings that are relevant for me. So this is what it should look like, and ideally you have some articles that address all or multiple of your points. It's totally okay to have a few articles that address only one of your points. Ideally you should have a couple of articles addressing each one of your main points. And so when I go to write this paper, I'm going to have a section that is about how the college transition affects well-being, and I'm going to look at any of my articles that address this. So, I had one article that addresses decreased loneliness. The middle school transition is associated with low self-esteem and higher loneliness. College was associated with more depression and loneliness. So I could make a statement like, in general, the college transition has been associated with increased loneliness, and I can cite all 3 studies that found that. In addition, middle school transitions have found increased loneliness as well, and I can cite this Ledoux article. And so having this organized in terms of the general ideas and themes is a really powerful tool in terms of kind of wrapping your head around what the evidence suggests. So for this week, you just need to turn in 5 sources and complete the table in the worksheet, but I would really encourage you to take the time, even if you don't do it before this week's deadline, before next week, to figure out where all of your sources kind of fit into this worksheet. Where do they fit into your themes? Generally, I recommend that students have kind of 3 main themes or arguments in your paper. If you have a 4th, you might also add a 4th theme to your columns, another column for another theme. That's another option. But use this. Generally, students who spend the time to do this find it's a really useful tool in organizing their thinking.